HOA cops smashed his door, yelling, "You're in violation." So his Navy SEAL team paid their HQ a visit. It was supposed to be an ordinary morning. But when the pounding fists and thunderous shouts rattled his front door, everything changed. "Open up! You're in violation!" screamed men dressed like cops but carrying HOA badges. Seconds later, his door was smashed off its hinges. They weren't there for drugs or weapons. They were there for something far pettier and far more sinister. What they didn't know was that the man inside wasn't just any homeowner. He was a retired Navy SEAL, and when they humiliated him on his own porch, they unknowingly set themselves on a collision course with his brothers in arms. Marcus Green had lived in the same suburban neighborhood for 8 years. A quiet man in his mid-40s, he had chosen the community because it promised peace and order, values he thought he'd find comforting after 2 decades of combat deployments. The HOA boasted about upholding standards, and for Marcus, it sounded like structure, something he understood. But Marcus quickly learned those rules weren't applied equally. White neighbors parked RVs in their driveways, painted their shutters neon colors, and ignored landscaping guidelines with no consequence. Marcus, however, received violation notices for minor things: a flower bed out of alignment, a flagpole that was 1 inch taller than regulation, and once, even for leaving his trash bin on the curb a few hours too long. Still, Marcus stayed quiet. Years of discipline had taught him restraint. But as months passed, the targeting grew blatant. Neighbors whispered that the HOA president had made remarks about keeping the neighborhood looking a certain way. Marcus tried to brush it off, but the hostility was obvious. Then came the breaking point. Instead of another petty notice, Marcus awoke to fists hammering on his door. His security cameras recorded it all. 3 men in tactical-style vests with HOA patches, accompanied by 2 off-duty cops hired as muscle. They shouted that his property was non-compliant and stormed in. Marcus stood stunned as they shoved past him, taking photos and tossing around his belongings like he was a criminal. It wasn't about violations anymore. It was about power and humiliation. What they didn't know was that Marcus had allies far stronger than any HOA board. Word spread quickly. Neighbors peeked through blinds as the men dragged Marcus's American flag out of his yard, claiming it violated HOA height restrictions. The same flag he had carried during deployments. The same flag folded and presented at funerals for brothers who never made it home. To the HOA, it was just a rule. To Marcus, it was sacred. He stayed composed as they swaggered off, warning him of hefty fines and possible eviction. But inside, something ignited. Not rage, but resolve. He didn't immediately fight back. Instead, Marcus called a few old contacts, men who owed him nothing but loyalty, forged in deserts and jungles far away. Within 24 hours, 2 black SUVs rolled into his driveway. Out stepped his SEAL brothers, men built like tanks, disciplined, methodical, and fiercely protective of their own. The neighborhood watched in awe. For years, the HOA had bullied quietly, targeting certain families, fining them into submission. But now the game had changed. These weren't average homeowners. They were men trained to dismantle cartels, extract hostages, and neutralize threats with precision. The SEALs didn't storm into meetings with fists. They did something far more devastating. They investigated. Within days, they uncovered that the HOA president had been misusing funds, falsifying violation records, and selectively targeting families of color. They compiled evidence, documented everything, and prepared it with military precision. But the HOA board wasn't backing down. They doubled fines, sent more compliance officers to harass Marcus, and even threatened foreclosure. The arrogance was staggering. They still thought Marcus was just one man. At the next HOA meeting, however, that illusion shattered. Marcus and his team walked in, calm and unshaken. They didn't raise their voices. They didn't make threats. They simply laid down binders of evidence, detailing years of corruption, racist targeting, and financial fraud. Neighbors gasped as documents were read aloud, exposing everything. The board sat frozen, pale-faced, knowing their empire of intimidation was crumbling. But the SEALs weren't finished yet. The fallout came fast. Marcus's SEAL brothers filed formal complaints with the city council, county authorities, and even the state attorney's office. Local media picked up the story. Veteran harassed by HOA over flag, exposes years of racist abuse. The HOA tried to fight back, claiming Marcus was aggressive and non-compliant. But every claim was shredded with video footage, witness testimony, and paper trails of their fraud. When they insisted Marcus's flagpole was against regulations, reporters zoomed in on footage of 3 white neighbors with taller flagpoles untouched by fines. And then came the turning point. Federal investigators got involved. The HOA headquarters, the very one that had dispatched men to smash Marcus's door, was raided. Financial crimes, discriminatory practices, and illegal enforcement tactics spilled into public view. The same men who had barged into Marcus's home were led out in handcuffs. The president, once smug and untouchable, now stood before flashing cameras, his arrogance gone. But the most powerful moment came when Marcus stood quietly outside, his flag once again raised tall in his yard. Reporters asked what drove him to fight back. He didn't boast about his Navy SEAL background. He simply said, respect. No one should be humiliated in their own home, especially not for the color of their skin. The neighborhood transformed almost overnight. The corrupt board was dissolved, replaced by a temporary committee of fair-minded residents. Fines were refunded, foreclosures reversed, and rules rewritten with transparency. Families who had once lived in fear of harassment stepped outside again with pride. But the impact stretched far beyond one neighborhood. News outlets across the country highlighted the case as an example of HOA abuse and racial bias. Legislators began proposing reforms, citing Marcus's ordeal as proof of how unchecked power could spiral into injustice. For Marcus, it wasn't about revenge. It was about accountability. He and his brothers had fought battles overseas for freedom, only to find injustice lurking in their own backyard. And just like before, they stood together and dismantled it piece by piece. Still, Marcus never saw himself as a hero. He returned to his quiet routines, coffee on the porch, flag waving above. But to his neighbors, he was more than that. He was proof that silence enables oppression, and that courage, even against something as small as an HOA, could ripple into change. The question lingered long after the cameras left. How many others are silently enduring the same abuse, too afraid to speak up? And when their doors are smashed, who will stand beside them? Because sometimes the fight for justice doesn't happen in foreign lands. Sometimes it begins right at your own front door.